When the elderly woman handed me that crumpled piece of paper on the scorching Arizona highway, and I recognized my deceased wife's handwriting staring back at me, I knew that some encounters are orchestrated by forces beyond our understanding, and that sometimes the most profound love stories begin exactly when we think our story has already ended. My name is Robert Chen, and for 42 years I've been driving charter buses across the American Southwest. But this isn't just another tale about miles logged and passengers transported. This is about how a routine trip from Phoenix to Los Angeles on Interstate 10 became the day I discovered that love doesn't end with death. It simply finds new ways to reach us when we need it most. And sometimes the people we're destined to help end up healing wounds we didn't even know were still bleeding. It was September 3rd, a Thursday morning when the thermometer was already climbing toward 112 degrees, and I was making my regular eastbound run with 36 passengers heading to various destinations across Southern California. Mile marker 178, just outside Quartzsite, Arizona, that's where I saw her standing beside her broken-down sedan, an elegant woman who appeared to be in her 70s, wearing a pale blue dress that seemed far too formal for the desert heat, waving frantically at every vehicle that passed without slowing down for someone who obviously needed assistance. My first instinct was to radio dispatch and let the highway patrol handle whatever automotive emergency was unfolding in temperatures that could be dangerous for anyone. But something about the way she stood there with such dignity, despite her obvious distress, told me this wasn't just a simple breakdown that could wait for official help to arrive. As I pulled my bus onto the shoulder and activated the emergency flashes, the passengers behind me looked up from their books and devices, probably expecting another routine rest stop. But I had no idea I was about to step into a moment that would challenge everything I thought I understood about coincidence, destiny, and the mysterious ways that departed souls continue to guide the living. She couldn't have been standing there long because her silver hair was still perfectly styled, and her clothing showed no signs of prolonged exposure to the brutal Arizona sun. But her car's hood was up, and steam was rising from the engine in a way that suggested serious mechanical problems that wouldn't be resolved with a simple phone call to roadside assistance. As I approached her through waves of heat rising from the asphalt, I noticed she was clutching something in her right hand, holding it against her chest like it contained information too precious to risk losing in the desert wind. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I called out as I got closer, and when she looked up at me with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and something that looked almost like recognition, I felt that strange sensation you get when you meet someone who seems familiar even though you're certain you've never seen them before. "Do you need me to call a tow truck or the highway patrol? It's dangerous for anyone to be stranded out here in this heat, especially someone who might not be accustomed to desert conditions." Instead of answering my questions about her car trouble or her need for mechanical assistance, she simply extended her hand toward me with that same item she'd been holding against her chest, and I could see now that it was a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been carried around for years, handled so many times that the edges were soft and the creases were permanent. "Please," she said in a voice that was barely audible over the sound of trucks rushing past, "please read this. I know this is going to sound impossible, but I think you're exactly who I've been looking for, and I believe this note will explain everything better than I ever could." The paper felt warm in my hands, not just from the desert heat, but as if it had absorbed years of being held by someone who treasured whatever words were written inside. And as I carefully unfolded it, I noticed that the handwriting was elegant, flowing, the kind of penmanship that belonged to a generation that learned to write with fountain pens and took pride in making every letter beautiful. But when I actually read the words, when I saw what was written in that familiar script, my knees almost buckled, and I had to grab the woman's arm to steady myself because I was looking at something that should have been impossible. "My dearest Robert," the note began, and the handwriting was unmistakably my wife Helen's, even though Helen had been gone for 3 years, and this piece of paper was in the hands of a complete stranger standing in the Arizona desert. If you're reading this, it means that Margaret found you, and it means that the promise I made to help you find love again is finally being kept. I know you think your heart died with me, sweetheart, but there's so much more happiness waiting for you if you'll just be brave enough to open yourself to the possibility that our love story isn't ending. It's just making room for a new chapter that I want you to write with someone who deserves all the tenderness you have left to give." I read those words 3 times before I could even begin to process what was happening, And when I finally looked up at the woman who had given me this impossible message from beyond the grave, she was watching me with the kind of understanding expression that suggested she knew exactly what emotional earthquake I was experiencing. "Your name is Margaret?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended because my throat was tight with emotions I couldn't even begin to categorize. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd stopped to help her, she smiled with the kind of warmth that told me this encounter was no accident. "Margaret Sullivan, and yes, I knew your wife Helen very well. We met at the Cancer Treatment Center in Tucson 2 years before she passed away, and we became very close during those long months of chemotherapy sessions and radiation treatments. She talked about you constantly, Robert, about how much she loved you, how worried she was about leaving you alone, how desperately she wanted to make sure you wouldn't spend the rest of your life grieving for something that was already complete, instead of looking forward to something that could still be beautiful. The desert heat was making it difficult to think clearly, and the emotional impact of holding a note in my deceased wife's handwriting was making it even harder to process the reality of what Margaret was telling me. But I knew I needed to get both of us out of the sun and into air conditioning before we could continue this conversation that was already changing everything I thought I knew about Helen's final months and her concerns about my future. "Margaret, we need to get you on my bus where it's cool, and then you need to tell me everything about how you knew my wife and how you came to have this note, because right now I feel like I'm living in some kind of dream or hallucination brought on by too much sun and not enough understanding of what's actually happening here." As I helped Margaret gather her purse and a small overnight bag from her disabled car, she looked back at the vehicle with an expression of rueful amusement. "You know, Robert, this breakdown wasn't entirely unexpected. Helen told me that when the time was right, when you were finally ready to hear what she wanted to tell you about moving forward with your life, the universe would create the circumstances for our paths to cross. She said it might happen in an unusual way, and that I should be prepared to trust that whatever brought us together would be part of the plan she was trying to set in motion." The 36 passengers on my bus looked up with curiosity and concern as I helped Margaret up the steps and settled her into the front seat where she'd be closest to the air conditioning and where I could continue our conversation without the entire bus overhearing details that were clearly going to be deeply personal. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced over the intercom, "we've picked up a passenger whose car broke down in this heat, and we're going to make sure she gets to safety before we continue on our scheduled route. Thank you for your patience and understanding." The response was immediate and heartwarming, with several passengers offering Margaret water bottles, snacks, and even phone chargers, the kind of spontaneous kindness that reminds you there are still good people in the world who understand that helping someone in distress is more important than maintaining rigid schedules. But as I pulled back onto Interstate 10 and began driving toward the next town with adequate services for Margaret's car situation, she reached into her purse and withdrew another folded paper, this one looking even more worn and cherished than the first. "Helen gave me 2 notes, Robert," she said quietly, making sure her voice wouldn't carry to the other passengers. "The first one was to get your attention and help you understand that this meeting isn't a coincidence. The second one contains the information she really wanted you to have, the things she couldn't say while she was dying because she knew you weren't ready to hear them yet, and she was afraid that if she pushed too hard, you might make promises about moving on that you had no intention of keeping." As we drove through the Arizona landscape with Margaret settled beside me, she began to share the story of her friendship with Helen during those final difficult months, and every detail she revealed made it clear that my wife had been planning this encounter with the same meticulous care she'd always brought to everything that mattered to her. Margaret explained that she and Helen had been assigned adjoining recliners during their chemotherapy sessions at the Desert Hope Cancer Center, and what began as polite conversation between 2 women facing similar battles had quickly evolved into the kind of deep friendship that forms when people are confronting their mortality and discover they can be completely honest with each other about their fears, hopes, and regrets. "Helen was worried about you from the very beginning," Margaret continued, her voice taking on the gentle tone that people use when they're sharing memories of someone they cared about deeply. "Not worried about your ability to take care of yourself or manage the practical aspects of life without her, but worried that you would decide her death meant the end of your capacity for happiness, that you would treat loving her like it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience that could never be repeated or expanded upon. She used to say that you had so much love to give, so much tenderness and kindness and companionship to offer, that it would be a tragedy if all of that died with her instead of finding new ways to flourish. The second note that Margaret handed me was thicker than the first, written on both sides of the paper in Helen's careful handwriting, and I could tell just by holding it that this contained the heart of whatever message my wife had been trying to send across the divide between life and death. But before I opened it, I needed to understand more about Margaret herself, about who she was and why Helen had chosen her as the messenger for communications that were clearly meant to guide my future in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. "Margaret, tell me about yourself," I said, as we passed a sign indicating we were approaching Blythe, California, where I could arrange for a tow truck and help her figure out next steps for her car situation. "Helen obviously trusted you with something incredibly important to her, something that involved her deepest concerns about my well-being after she was gone. That tells me you two shared more than just medical appointments and hospital waiting rooms." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful, and I could see her mentally organizing information she'd probably been hoping to share ever since she'd first spotted my bus approaching her broken-down car. "I'm 74 years old, Robert, and I've been a widow for 8 years. My husband David passed away from a heart attack when he was 69, and I went through many of the same struggles that Helen was worried you would experience. The difference is that I had Helen's friendship and wisdom to help me understand that loving David completely didn't mean I could never love anyone else, that honoring his memory didn't require me to shut down all possibilities for future happiness." As Margaret spoke about her own journey through grief and eventual acceptance of the idea that life could still hold joy and companionship after profound loss, I began to understand why Helen had chosen her as the person who could help me navigate similar emotional territory. Margaret wasn't just someone who had shared Helen's medical challenges. She was someone who had successfully walked the path that Helen hoped I would eventually be willing to explore, someone who could speak from experience about the possibility of building new love without diminishing or betraying the love that came before. "Helen and I spent hours talking about you, Robert, about your marriage, about the kind of man you were, about how much you loved her, and how completely you took care of her during her illness. But she also talked about her fears that your devotion to her was so absolute that you might not be able to imagine that devotion expanding to include someone new, rather than just ending when she was no longer there to receive it. She was particularly worried that you would interpret moving on as some kind of betrayal of what you'd shared together. The traffic was getting heavier as we approached the California border, and I found myself driving more slowly than usual because I wanted to give Margaret as much time as possible to explain Helen's plan before we reached Blythe and had to focus on the practical matter of dealing with her disabled vehicle. The other passengers seemed content to read, sleep, or watch the desert scenery pass by their windows, unaware that the two people in the front seats were having a conversation that was reshaping one man's understanding of love, loss, and the possibility that some stories are meant to have multiple chapters. "The plan Helen developed was beautifully simple," Margaret continued, pulling the second note from her purse and holding it without yet giving it to me. "She asked me to wait 2 years after her death, long enough for you to work through the initial stages of grief, but not so long that you became permanently closed off to new possibilities. Then she wanted me to find a way to cross paths with you that would seem natural enough that you wouldn't feel manipulated, but meaningful enough that you'd be willing to pay attention to what she wanted to tell you." Before Margaret could explain more about Helen's elaborate scheme to bring us together, I realized we needed to pause this life-changing conversation long enough for me to address the practical realities of our situation and make sure Margaret received the help she needed for her immediate transportation problems. But I also realized that everything about this encounter felt too significant to treat as just another roadside assistance situation, and I found myself hoping that helping Margaret would lead to opportunities for more conversations about Helen's message and whatever future she'd been trying to help me envision. Let me pause here for a moment to speak directly to those of you who are still with us, still listening to this story that began with a broken-down car in the Arizona desert and has already revealed layers of planning, friendship, and love that extend beyond the boundaries between life and death. If you're still here, it tells me something important about who you are. It tells me you understand that the most meaningful moments in our lives often come disguised as ordinary encounters, that love stories don't always end when we think they do, and that sometimes the most profound healing happens when we're brave enough to believe that our capacity for happiness doesn't have to die just because someone we love has died. This isn't just entertainment for you, is it? This is recognition, validation, hope. Maybe you've lost someone you thought you couldn't live without. Maybe you've wondered if it's possible to honor a great love while still being open to new love. Maybe you've felt guilty about the possibility that your heart might have room for more than one complete, transformative relationship in a single lifetime. If any of that resonates with you, if Robert and Margaret's story is touching something deep in your own experience, I want you to know that you're not alone in wondering about these things. The truth is, we share these stories not because they're unusual, but because they represent feelings and experiences that are more common than we often admit. The fear that loving someone new means betraying someone who's gone. The worry that we only get one chance at the kind of deep, meaningful partnership that makes life feel complete. The question of whether it's possible to be grateful for what we had while still being excited about what we might still have. These are universal concerns, and they deserve to be talked about with the honesty and respect that Margaret and Robert are bringing to their conversation. If this story is speaking to your heart, if it's reminding you of your own questions about love and loss, and the possibility that our best chapters might still be ahead of us, would you consider being part of our community here? Not because I'm asking you to subscribe to just another channel, but because I believe that when we share these deeply human stories with each other, when we acknowledge that we're all trying to figure out how to love well and live fully despite loss and uncertainty, we create something precious. We create space for healing, for hope, for the kind of conversations that remind us we don't have to navigate life's biggest questions alone. So if you're ready to be part of a place where stories like this matter, where the complexities of the human heart are honored rather than simplified, where we believe that it's never too late for new love and never wrong to keep growing, I'd love for you to join us. And please leave a comment and tell us about your own experiences with love that transcends loss, with healing that surprised you, with moments when you realized that your story wasn't over, even when you thought it was. This is more than just a channel. It's a community for people who understand that the most important journeys are the ones we take toward each other, no matter what age we are or what losses we've endured. Margaret and I spent the next 2 hours at a truck stop in Blythe, California, waiting for Adelaide to arrange a tow truck for her disabled sedan, while she continued sharing the details of Helen's carefully orchestrated plan to guide me toward a future I'd been too afraid to imagine. As we sat in a corner booth at the diner, surrounded by the ambient noise of truckers, tourists, and travelers, Margaret finally handed me Helen's second note, but not before explaining more about the friendship that had developed between two women who understood they were both facing the end of life as they'd known it. "Your wife was remarkable, Robert," Margaret said, stirring sugar into her coffee with the same careful attention to detail I remembered Helen bringing to everything she did. "Even while she was fighting for every extra day she could have with you, she was also planning for your happiness after she was gone. She used to say that loving someone completely meant wanting their life to continue being beautiful even when you couldn't be part of it anymore. And she was determined to do everything in her power to make sure you understood that moving forward wasn't the same thing as moving away from what you'd shared together." The note felt substantial in my hands, and I could see that Helen had written it over multiple sessions because the ink changed slightly from paragraph to paragraph, suggesting she'd returned to it repeatedly, adding thoughts and revisions as her ideas about what she wanted to tell me became clearer and more complete. The first few lines were enough to make my eyes fill with tears because they captured Helen's voice so perfectly that I could almost hear her speaking the words aloud. "My beloved Robert," the note began, "if Margaret has found you and you're reading this, it means I've been gone long enough for you to miss me terribly, but hopefully not so long that you've forgotten how much joy we found in loving each other completely. I'm writing this during one of my better days, when the treatments aren't making me too tired to think clearly, because I need you to understand some things that I couldn't say while I was dying. Not because I didn't want to tell you these things, but because I knew you wouldn't be able to hear them, while you were focused on taking care of me and hoping against hope that somehow we'd have more time together." The note went on to explain that during her final months, Helen had become close friends not just with Margaret, but with several other women who were also facing terminal diagnoses, and that their conversations had revealed how common it was for dying spouses to worry more about the loneliness their partners would face than about their own approaching deaths. Helen wrote about watching me struggle with the reality of her illness, about recognizing that my devotion to her was so complete that I might not be able to imagine that same capacity for love finding new expression with someone else. I know you, sweetheart, Helen's note continued, and I know that you're probably thinking that what we had was so perfect, so complete, that trying to love someone else would somehow diminish it or prove that it wasn't as special as we both believed it was. But that's not how love works, Robert. Love isn't a finite resource that gets used up or divided. Love is something that grows stronger the more we share it, something that becomes more beautiful when we discover new ways to express it. The love we share doesn't become less precious because you find someone else to love. It becomes the foundation that makes you capable of loving even more deeply. Margaret watched me read Helen's words with the patient understanding of someone who knew exactly what emotional journey I was experiencing, someone who had probably gone through similar revelations when she'd first been forced to confront the possibility that David's death didn't mean the end of her own capacity for happiness. She spent months planning this, Robert, not just writing the notes, but figuring out how to make sure our paths would cross in a way that wouldn't feel forced or manipulative. She knew you'd be suspicious if someone just called you up claiming to be her friend with a message from beyond the grave. As I continued reading Helen's note, I learned about conversations she'd had with Margaret about my work schedule, my bus routes, my habits and preferences, in ways that made it clear she'd been thinking strategically about how to create circumstances that would bring Margaret and me together naturally. Helen had discovered that Margaret lived in Sedona, Arizona, and that she frequently drove to Los Angeles to visit her daughter and grandchildren, always taking Interstate 10 because she preferred the desert route to the mountain highways that made her nervous. Margaret has agreed to help me with something that I hope will change your life in beautiful ways, Helen's note explained. She's going to wait until enough time has passed for you to work through the worst of your grief, and then she's going to find a way to meet you that will give her the opportunity to share not just these notes, but her own story about learning to love again after loss. She's 74 years old, Robert, which makes her exactly the right age for you. She's intelligent, kind, independent, and she understands what it means to build a life with someone and then have to figure out how to keep living when that someone is gone. The revelation that this entire encounter had been orchestrated by Helen as a form of matchmaking from beyond the grave should have felt overwhelming or manipulative, but instead it felt like the most loving gift anyone had ever tried to give me. Here was my wife facing her own death, spending her remaining energy not on self-pity or despair, but on trying to ensure that I would have companionship and love for whatever years I had left. The generosity of it, the selflessness, the absolute trust in my ability to love her completely while also loving someone new, was almost more than I could comprehend. I want you to get to know Margaret, sweetheart, Helen's note continued. Not because I think you should immediately fall in love with her or make any quick decisions about your future, but because I think you'll discover that she's the kind of woman you could build something beautiful with if you're both willing to be patient and honest about what you're looking for. She's looking for companionship, not a replacement for David. You're looking for someone to share your remaining years with, not a replacement for me. Maybe those two desires can complement each other in ways that will surprise both of you. Margaret had been sitting quietly while I read, occasionally sipping her coffee or glancing out the window at the desert landscape, giving me the space I needed to process Helen's words and the enormity of what she'd been trying to accomplish. But when I finally looked up from the note, she was watching me with an expression that was both hopeful and cautious, clearly wondering how I was responding to the discovery that our meeting had been anything but accidental. Helen told me you might be angry when you realized what she'd done, Margaret said gently. She worried that you might feel manipulated or think she was trying to control your future from the grave. But she also hoped you'd understand that everything she did came from love, from wanting your life to continue being full of joy and connection and all the things that made your marriage so special. I folded Helen's note carefully and placed it in my shirt pocket next to my heart, where I'd probably keep it for the rest of my life. Margaret, I'm not angry. I'm amazed. I'm overwhelmed. I'm grateful beyond words that Helen loved me enough to spend her final months planning for my happiness instead of just focusing on her own suffering. But I'm also scared, because I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to meet someone new without feeling like I'm betraying Helen's memory, and I don't know how to love someone else without comparing everything to what Helen and I had together. Margaret reached across the table and took my hand in both of hers, and her touch was gentle, comforting, completely without pressure or expectation. "Robert, we don't have to figure everything out today. We don't have to make any decisions or promises or commitments." Helen knew that, which is why she planned for us to meet in a situation where we could just talk, just get to know each other, just see if there's a foundation for friendship that might eventually grow into something more. Would you be willing to start there? Just friendship, just conversation, just the possibility that two people who have both loved deeply and lost deeply might be able to find comfort in each other's company. The tow truck arrived, just as Margaret and I were finishing our coffee and trying to figure out what should happen next in this carefully orchestrated encounter that Helen had planned with such thoughtful precision. Margaret's sedan would need to be towed to a repair shop in Blythe, and the mechanic estimated it would take at least 3 days to get the necessary parts and complete the work, which meant Margaret was temporarily stranded in a small desert town with no transportation and no easy way to continue her journey to Los Angeles, where her daughter was expecting her for a long-planned visit. "This is exactly what Helen predicted would happen," Margaret said with a mixture of amusement and wonder as we watched her car being loaded onto the flatbed truck. "She said that when the universe decided it was time for us to meet, circumstances would conspire to give us more than just a brief roadside encounter. She said we'd need time to really talk, to share our stories, to figure out if there was any possibility that two people our age could build something new and meaningful together." The practical solution was obvious, though it felt momentous in ways that neither of us could ignore. I had a bus full of passengers who needed to reach their destinations in Los Angeles, but I also had return trips scheduled for the following day, and Margaret's 3-day wait for car repairs aligned perfectly with my route schedule in ways that seemed too convenient to be purely coincidental. "Margaret, I can take you with me to Los Angeles today, and then when I make my return trip to Phoenix on Saturday, I can pick you up and bring you back here to collect your car. That would give you the visit with your daughter that you were planning, and it would give us some time to continue the conversation that Helen apparently wanted us to have." As we climbed back aboard my bus and I explained the situation to my passengers, their response was overwhelmingly supportive and encouraging, with several elderly women commenting that Margaret and I made a lovely couple and that it was beautiful to see romance blooming between people who understood what real love looked like. Their assumptions embarrassed both Margaret and me, but they also created a sense of possibility that neither of us had been expecting when our day began with a routine drive across the Arizona desert. The 3-hour journey from Blythe to Los Angeles passed more quickly than I could have imagined, because Margaret and I discovered that Helen had been absolutely correct in her assessment that we would have plenty to talk about. We shared stories about our marriages, our children, our careers, our hobbies, our dreams for whatever years we had remaining, and with every passing mile it became clearer that Helen's matchmaking instincts had been remarkably accurate. Margaret and I shared similar values, complementary personalities, and the kind of life experience that made conversation easy and comfortable even when we were discussing sensitive topics. "Tell me about David," I said as we passed through the desert communities between the Colorado River and the San Bernardino Mountains. "Helen obviously thought you and I had similar experiences with marriage and loss, but I'd like to understand what your relationship was like and how you've been managing since he's been gone." Margaret's face lit up with the same expression I probably got when someone asked me about Helen, the mixture of sadness and joy that comes from remembering someone who brought tremendous happiness into your life, even though their absence left a permanent ache in your heart. "David was an English teacher at the high school in Sedona for 37 years, and I was the school librarian for most of that time, so we literally worked together every day for decades. We were best friends first, then colleagues, then lovers, then spouses, then partners in everything that mattered. When he died, I didn't just lose my husband, I lost my closest friend, my daily companion, my collaborator in making our little corner of the world more beautiful." As Margaret described her marriage to David and the adjustment she'd had to make to living alone after 38 years of constant companionship, I recognized so many parallels to my own experience with Helen that it was almost eerie. We'd both been married to educators who brought intellectual curiosity and deep empathy to everything they did. We'd both experienced marriages that were characterized by friendship, mutual respect, and genuine enjoyment of each other's company. We'd both struggled with the practical and emotional challenges of learning to live independently after decades of making every decision in consultation with someone else. "The hardest part," Margaret continued, wasn't the big milestones or holidays or anniversaries, though those were certainly difficult. The hardest part was all the small moments when I wanted to share something with David and remembered he wasn't there to share it with. Seeing a beautiful sunset and turning to comment on it to someone who wasn't beside me anymore. Reading something interesting in a book and wanting to discuss it with someone who would understand why it mattered. Making decisions about what to have for dinner when there was no one else's preferences to consider. Margaret's description of the loneliness that comes not from dramatic moments of grief, but from the accumulated weight of thousands of small moments when you remember that your closest companion is gone, resonated so completely with my own experience that I found myself sharing details about my adjustment to widowhood that I'd never discussed with anyone else. The way I still sometimes bought Helen's favorite ice cream at the grocery store before remembering she wouldn't be there to share it. The way I still reached for the phone to call her when something funny happened during my workday. The way I still slept on my side of our bed, even though there was no practical reason not to spread out across the entire mattress. "Robert," Margaret said quietly as we approached the Los Angeles city limits, "I want you to know that I didn't agree to Helen's plan because I was looking for a husband or because I was unhappy with my life as it is. I have good friends, fulfilling volunteer work, a close relationship with my daughter and her family. I'm not desperately lonely or unable to take care of myself, but I am open to the possibility that companionship doesn't have to end just because the person who provided it originally is no longer available to continue doing so." The clarity and honesty of Margaret's statement helped me articulate feelings I'd been struggling to understand ever since I'd first read Helen's notes. "I think I understand what you're saying, and I think it matches what I've been feeling without quite knowing how to express it. I'm not looking for someone to fill the hole that Helen left, because that hole is permanent and I don't want it filled. Helen was irreplaceable, and what we had together was complete and perfect and doesn't need to be duplicated or improved upon. But I am beginning to realize that loving Helen completely doesn't mean I can never love anyone else, and that being grateful for what we shared doesn't mean I have to spend the rest of my life alone." As I navigated Los Angeles traffic toward the address where Margaret's daughter lived, we began making tentative plans for the next phase of whatever was developing between us. Margaret would spend 3 days visiting with her family, while I completed my scheduled runs between Los Angeles and Phoenix. Then, on Saturday, I would pick her up for the return trip to Arizona, and we would use that journey to continue exploring the possibility that Helen had been right about our compatibility and potential for building something meaningful together. "There's one more thing Helen wanted me to give you," Margaret said, as I pulled up in front of a comfortable-looking house in suburban Pasadena, where a woman who was obviously Margaret's daughter was already coming out the front door to greet us. "But she asked me to wait until we'd had time to talk, until we'd both had a chance to decide if we wanted to pursue the friendship she was hoping would develop between us. If you're willing to continue getting to know each other, if you think there's potential for something more than just polite conversation between two people who happen to meet on a highway, then I'll share Helen's final message with you when we make the drive back to Arizona." Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect desert clarity that made everything seem possible, and when I pulled up in front of Margaret's daughter's house in Pasadena to begin our return journey to Arizona, I realized that the 3 days we'd spent apart had only strengthened my conviction that Helen's matchmaking instincts had been absolutely correct. Margaret emerged from the house carrying a small suitcase and wearing a smile that told me she'd been looking forward to our reunion as much as I had, and as she settled into the passenger seat beside me, she handed me an envelope that I immediately recognized as containing Helen's final message. "Before you read this," Margaret said as we began navigating through Los Angeles traffic toward Interstate 10, "I want you to know that I spent considerable time this week talking with my daughter about you, about Helen's plan, about the possibility that her 74-year-old mother might be starting a romantic relationship with a man she'd only known for a few days. Sarah was skeptical at first, worried that I might be vulnerable to manipulation or too eager for companionship after 8 years of widowhood. But when I described our conversations and shared some of the things Helen had written about you, she became much more supportive of the idea." The envelope felt different from Helen's previous notes, heavier somehow, as if it contained not just words but some kind of tangible blessing or permission that she'd been saving for the moment when Margaret and I had decided we wanted to explore the possibility of building a future together. "Margaret, Before I read whatever Helen's final message says, I need you to know that these past 3 days apart have given me time to think about everything that's happened since you flagged down my bus in the Arizona desert. I keep coming back to the same realization. Helen knew me better than I knew myself, and she understood that loving her completely didn't mean I could never love anyone else. As we drove through the California desert toward Arizona, I opened Helen's final envelope and discovered that it contained not just another note, but also her wedding ring, the simple gold band that she'd worn for 41 years of marriage and that I'd placed in her jewelry box after the funeral, because I couldn't bear to think about what else to do with something so precious and irreplaceable. The note that accompanied the ring was shorter than her previous messages, but its emotional impact was even more profound, because it represented Helen's final attempt to guide me toward a future she hoped would be filled with love and happiness. My dearest Robert, Helen's final note began, if you're reading this, it means that you and Margaret have decided to see if the friendship I hoped would develop between you might grow into something deeper and more lasting. I'm including my wedding ring not because I want you to give it to Margaret, or because I think she should replace me in your heart, but because I want you to have a tangible reminder that the love we shared was real, complete, and eternal, and that it will never be diminished by any new love you might discover. Helen's note went on to explain that she'd spent considerable time during her final months thinking about the nature of love and whether it was possible for one person to experience multiple profound relationships without diminishing any of them. Her conversations with Margaret and other women at the cancer center had convinced her that the human heart was capable of expanding rather than dividing, that loving someone new after loss was not betrayal, but rather evidence that the first relationship had been successful in teaching someone how to love deeply and completely. I want you to keep my ring, sweetheart, and I want you to remember every day for the rest of your life that what we shared was perfect and complete, and nothing can ever change that. But I also want you to understand that the love I taught you to give and receive, the capacity for tenderness and partnership, and daily kindness that we developed together, these are gifts that shouldn't die with me. They should find new expression, new recipients, new ways of making the world more beautiful. Margaret had been reading Helen's note over my shoulder as we drove, and when we both reached the part where Helen expressed her hope that Margaret and I would be able to create something meaningful together, Margaret reached over and took my hand in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. Robert, I need you to know that I would never try to replace Helen, and I would never want you to forget what you shared with her or pretend that our relationship is the same as what you had with her. But I would very much like to see if we can build something new and beautiful together, something that honors both David's memory and Helen's memory, while also creating space for new joy and companionship. The remainder of our drive to Arizona was filled with conversations about practical matters and future possibilities that felt both exciting and comfortably familiar. We discussed where we might live if our relationship continued to develop, whether it made sense for one of us to relocate, or whether we should maintain separate residences in different states for some period of time. We talked about our children and how they might react to their parents entering new relationships at our age, and we were both pleasantly surprised to discover that Margaret's daughter and my son had both expressed support for our exploration of companionship and possibly marriage. Helen's final request, Margaret said as we collected her repaired car from the mechanic in Blythe, was that if you and I decided to pursue a relationship, we should do so openly and joyfully, without guilt or apology, or any sense that we were betraying the people we'd loved before. She said that the best tribute we could pay to our first marriages would be to demonstrate that they had taught us how to love so well that we were still capable of creating new love, even in our 70s. As we said goodbye in the parking lot of the repair shop, with Margaret preparing to drive back to Sedona and me getting ready to return to Phoenix, we made plans for the following weekend that felt like the natural next step in a relationship that had begun with a broken-down car and a message from beyond the grave. Margaret would drive to Phoenix on Friday evening, and we would spend the weekend together, exploring the city, visiting museums, sharing meals, and continuing the process of getting to know each other that Helen had initiated with such loving foresight. 6 months later, Margaret and I were married in a small ceremony in Sedona, surrounded by both our families and a few close friends who understood that love stories don't have age limits, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin exactly when we think the book is finished. Helen's wedding ring hangs on a chain around my neck, close to my heart, a daily reminder that the love we shared made it possible for me to love Margaret completely, without reservation or guilt. Margaret wears David's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, for the same reasons, and together we've created a marriage that honors our past while embracing our future. Today, Margaret and I split our time between her house in Sedona and my house in Phoenix, and we've discovered that companionship in our 70s brings different joys than the passionate romance of our younger years, but it's no less meaningful or transformative. We read books together, travel together, garden together, cook together, and share the kind of daily contentment that comes from understanding that love is not a finite resource, but rather something that grows stronger and more beautiful when it's shared generously and without fear. And here's what I want you to understand as we come to the end of this story. Every choice that led to Margaret and me finding each other was made possible by people who understood that love doesn't end with death. It simply transforms and finds new ways to express itself. Helen's decision to spend her final months planning for my happiness, Margaret's willingness to trust in a plan that must have seemed impossible, my eventual openness to the possibility that loving Helen completely didn't mean I could never love anyone else, all of these choices created something beautiful that wouldn't have existed otherwise. If this story has touched something in your heart, if it's reminded you that it's never too late for new love or new happiness, if it's helped you think differently about honoring the past while embracing the future, I'd be so grateful if you'd become part of our community here. We share these stories not just because they're heartwarming, but because they represent possibilities that exist for all of us, regardless of our age or our losses or our fears, about whether our best days are behind us. Subscribe if you believe that love stories don't have expiration dates, that companionship and joy and partnership can happen at any stage of life when we're brave enough to remain open to possibility. Leave a comment and tell us about your own experiences with love that transcends loss, with healing that surprised you, with moments when you discovered that your story wasn't over even when you thought it was. Share your thoughts about Helen's plan, about the possibility that people who love us want us to find happiness even after they're gone, about the courage it takes to love again after experiencing profound loss. Tell us about the Helens in your life, the people who loved you so completely that they wanted your happiness to continue long after they could no longer be part of it. Tell us about times when you had to choose between staying safe in grief and taking risks for the possibility of new joy. Tell us what you think about Margaret and Robert's story, whether it gives you hope for your own future, whether it changes how you think about love and loss, and the possibility that our hearts are capable of more than we sometimes imagine. This is more than just a channel. It's a community for people who believe that the most important journeys are the ones we take toward each other. No matter what obstacles we've faced, or what age we've reached, or how many times we've had to start over, we're here because we understand that hope is not naive, that love is not finite, that it's never too late to write new chapters in the story of our lives. Join us, share with us, and help us create a space where stories like Robert and Margaret's matter, where the complexities of the human heart are honored, and where we can all remember that the best is yet to come.